So in the professional development courses that I teach, there is one I've been teaching for a while, which is now about to shift to an online version as well, which is balance and motor control. And obviously got motor control in the title, so I have to talk about it, and it's a pretty important part. There's a comprehensive review of sensory inputs. We talk about everything from proprioceptive to tactile to vestibular. And then we consider some interesting experiments and research that reveals perhaps how our brain controls and our central nervous system controls things. We talk about integration of sensations, and then how perception then action, and some of the really strange and weird and wonderful conscious and unconscious strategies, from literature like split belt treadmills to galvanic vestibular stimulation to broken escalator effects, and all these really interesting things. We discuss motor learning strategies, but the multiple types of learning strategies, so we have a really flexible thinking about the many ways we can learn. And motor learning is obviously not motor control, but they're intricately linked together. We talk about how our patients maintain their balance, but what about motor control theories? And this is where it gets tricky. How do we cover the motor control theories? Because, as we know, there's not an all-encompassing grand theory of motor control. So one of the things that I've been trying to develop then to make it easier for physios is just, rather than discussing each theory separately, this makes it difficult to give context to the big picture. And each theory in some ways has its merits, and we want to talk about the merits of each theory in motor control in the case of how our patients are moving. So we can give an overview of all main theories and just link them all together. And the other thing is to consider, when we clinically observe our patients, when does it appear to support the theories? And this raises some really interesting discussion with physiotherapists. So in terms of the motor control theories, Mashup is one way I've just been trying to group together some of the main theories that for motor control, and bring them all together in some way to make physios see that big picture. So we have to consider some of the sort of basics that we know. Central nervous system organizes movement. The brain's capable of things in terms of planning and executing. So we know at a basic principle, there's the idea, there's the plan, we select a movement, and then we actually do move. And then naturally often then look into the functional neuroanatomy of where these processes might be happening. Like, where is the idea formed? How then do we plan a movement? Then thinking about the selection and the deep nuclei basal ganglia in selecting motor programs for certain things, the movement pathways themselves, which has been researched a lot, and then we talk about feedback, and obviously the role of the cerebellum plays a role in that form of learning. So this comes under the hierarchical theory of motor control, which is worth discussing. Then we look at the opposite. We look at things like muscle stretch reflex, and we look at responding reflexes and responses to movement. So we look at the stretch reflex, but then you think about reflexes and responses all around the body and how we actually respond to external stimuli and how it does that. And that comes under the Charles Sherrington's reflex theory of motor control. The other thing that's always up for discussion is how we move and how the many different ways we can actually move and move successfully. So the degrees of freedom of movement. And from the degrees of freedom of movement, we might have, plans for moving, say, to reach towards the touch target. And then from that, we may make an error. So we might have a sensory prediction error, and then we might have the opportunity to learn from that. But when we do move accurately, say, to reach a particular target with a movement, then there are a number of different variables that we can look at. So you can reach to a target and have different movement of your forearm. You can have different movement of your shoulder and still reach the target. You have different movement in your trunk and you can still reach the target. And these are what we call elemental variables that we discuss a lot in clinic. Then there's the variables of the outcome itself, which is the outcome variables. And all this comes under what would be the systems theory of motor control. Then moving on from that, some of the stuff we spent a lot of time at Flinders University with that particular assignment is thinking about other forms. So we think about our ability to know our state and also our predicted state about where we want to be when we move. And there are qualities there like body schema and spatial awareness, which come under discussion in that situation. Then there's the idea that from a predictor state, we have a feed-forward model of movement before we move and how we can use that to learn movements. We have the internal model of the movement and the movement program. Then we have the motor action itself, and we know our patients have limitations with that, with strength and spasticity and other things. You move to a target, and then you might have an error with that target, a sensory prediction error, and then there may be a way of sort of comparing predicted and actual state. The feedback controller can then feed back in, so say the cerebellum, for example, one mechanism that could feed back to then update and create new internal models. So this would all come under the computational theory of motor control, which is definitely worth discussing. If we come back to these variables, outcome variables and elemental variables, there's also been the talk about uncontrolled manifold, where if we were to look at movement variables, so elemental variables, where you move and the way you move is different, yet you're still able to successfully reach your outcome variable, these things can fall into what's called the uncontrolled manifold. And this has been researched a lot in terms of a theory of motor abundance. There's so many different ways of moving successfully. And then there's movements if you do where you don't meet the outcome variable. And these are called variables what you might call sort of bad variability. So there is this talk about good variability and bad variability. Certainly has relevance to us in training and certainly gives us advantage in our adaptability, which we try and manipulate within our training. The dynamical systems theory looks at self-organization, looks at attractors and constraints. And then we can also consider, like if you consider a muscle action, it may have a certain limits applied to it where it can reach some kind of equilibrium point. And this idea means that, there are spinal systems probably at play here that can control that equilibrium point in muscles. But then there can be descending commands coming down from higher centers, which might set the parameters. So it can set the threshold level. And so the threshold idea of control is really gaining momentum. And so that's more about the idea of the brain not having certain programs, but more setting parameters for movement that can be controlled. And then that brings us to the ecological theory, where there's a lot of talk about action and then action perception coupling and how we move in response to that perception and our affordances for action. So look at the big picture here. We've got different key theories: hierarchical theory, with the reflex theory, systems theory. We've also got the computational theory, dynamical systems theory, and the ecological theory. And you can see how they so interrelate, and they're based on different philosophies, but they certainly have some commonalities to them. As physios, we talk a lot about degrees of freedom of movement. We talk about feedback and types of feedback that we can apply, the cognitive ideas and selection of movement, which is important, movement pathways themselves, which has been researched to death. We're interested in body schema, spatial awareness as targets, what we do, manipulating motor action through splint, through spasticity, through strength, promoting error-based learning for implicit learning, motor abundance, variability is a big part of that, training adaptability, attractors and movement habits, manipulating constraints, and then also affordances for action. So you can see that there's topics that come up when we talk about motor control theories which have great relevance to us that we need to keep including in our conversations in relation to clinical reasoning and understanding how we move as we go forward.